Hello and welcome to episode 17 of No Time to Cry. We're your hosts. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Laura.
And Laura's still sick, guys.
I am. Sorry.
I
Sorry,
don't know
guys.
what's going on.
The sniffles and the snuffles will very much be background noise for the foreseeable, apparently. So, yeah, sorry about that. Sinuses are just, absolutely struggling for life, apparently.
Last week we said it was going to be a short episode because of that, and then we just got caught up. I feel like me probably even more than you, Laura. It felt like a bit of a, I needed to get all of that
was
out.
a therapy session.
Yeah, it felt like a therapy session. Apparently, I had a lot to talk about regarding that. But yeah, this week we wanted to go over something I've actually never heard anyone talk about, because I think most people say, I don't live with any regrets, but I think that's a good way to look at things. But we wanted to say, actually, there probably were a couple of things that we had regrets about, whether that be pre our parents dying or post, and then also look at it from a different angle, possibly where we've spoke to friends of ours that have mentioned about regrets that they have in terms of how they supported us, or maybe how we kind of spoke to them during that time. So yeah, we wanted to just have a little bit of a different take on an episode and talk about something that in general I don't think many people talk about. It's become a bit of a, I suppose the saying, like, no regrets, like don't live your life with any regrets. But for me, I get that. It's just something that I think you have to live and learn, and
Sometimes they're unavoidable. I think you like to sort of go through life and hope that you won't have any, but you just don't know sometimes how things are going to pan out. So,
and we spoke about that a little bit last week, where we mentioned about that friend that reached back out to us and took a lot of accountability, but ourselves, we kind of looked at it and said, do you know what, all three of us could have maybe done a bit more in that
100%,
that situation, and reaching out and having a bit more of a conversation earlier on rather than letting time go. So I suppose maybe in hindsight have a different opinion or a different way that you would have handled things. I don't think that regrets necessarily have to be these big overpowering negative parts of your life. It's maybe it's not regrets, maybe it's reflections, however you want to look at it. But yeah, we thought it was just a good topic to go over, didn't we, and have a bit of a chat about. So with that in mind, Laura, should we start maybe pre our parents passing away? I think we've probably touched on it a little bit, where Laura's maybe mentioned you'd wish that you'd seen more of your mum, or that you'd been able to be out of hospital a bit sooner, which is not necessarily something you have control over. But if you think about maybe the things that you did have control over at that time, you might not have any regrets. We've not spoke about this prior, but was there anything that you'd wish you'd done more of?
yeah, I think as you mentioned before, Shan, this is where the hindsight kind of notion comes in, because realistically I try and live my life so that I won't have any sort of what ifs or regrets in my head. But ultimately, when you lose a loved one unexpectedly, it's natural for you to sort of go into regret mode a little bit, because no matter how much you see someone or how close you are to them, you're always going to wish there'd been that one last time, or I'd spent that extra amount of time with that person. It's funny because I spent a lot of time with my mum. I spoke to her every day. I was like fortunate that I saw her, every other day. Pretty much every weekend I saw her as well. Because she was very intentional of getting people together.
Yeah.
As I've talked about before. So one of the things that brought my mum joy was making sure that she saw her family enjoying quality time. So whether that was over a roast dinner or a barbecue, over drinks, she'd always message us all to say, drinks at 3:00 and dinner on the table for 5. And she just loved to cook meals for us, really, home cooked food. And that is a regret I have all the time, because despite the fact that she did it every weekend, there were weekends when I had to say no because I had other plans that might have cropped up, or something else was going on in life. And I think, well, I always thought I'd have X amount more Sundays and Sunday roasts and barbecues with her, and unfortunately I didn't. And that haunts me a bit. I always say it to my husband, actually. I'm like, oh, why did we not go, to that particular roast dinner? And it might be when I've seen pictures or photos, for example,
You're not in
and I'm
it.
not in them. And That's why my mum didn't like pictures being taken of her particularly, and you can see that in terms of, like, the pictures of that I have over the last few years before she died, because the last photo I had of me, my mum, and my brother and sister together was, like, 2020.
Yeah.
And considering we saw each other, like, all the time, that hurt me a little bit, because I thought, "Oh, why did we not take more pictures?" And that's a regret.
Yeah, it's a big regret of mine, actually.
Pictures, videos, and I know some people sometimes are like, "Oh my gosh, you don't need to take pictures of everything," but, one day they will be the only thing that you have left of a person, and that does sound a little bit morbid, but it doesn't have to be. It can be, like, something really special and heartwarming, and I always think this now, that even if you're just taking a picture for the sake of having it in your photo album one day, you don't have to post it anywhere. It's just as a keepsake, and that's something that I always look back fondly on now, is photos of my mum, and like I say, I just wish I'd had more of her, more recent
Yeah.
to when she passed away. That's a huge regret of mine, but I'm sure it's similar for most people. What about you, Shan?
Yeah, that's definitely probably one of my biggest regrets, is just maybe not capturing more moments, because I spent a lot of time with my dad, probably in my sort of teenage years, that
Mm,
time where he was sort of sober and clean between me maybe coming into like adolescence, and then as I grew up, I used to go and spend time with him all the time. I'd go to his house. He lived about an hour or so away from me, so I'd spend sort of every other weekend or a couple of times a month there. And we used to do all different kinds of things. We had very similar taste in music, and I just don't have very many pictures. There's loads of pictures of me and my dad when I was a kid. I just don't have very many from when I was an adult. There's like one from a holiday when I was like a bit younger, um, a handful, like one at his wedding, to his obviously his second wife, and then one from um when I went to visit him. He was really unwell, actually. It was a period of his time where even in the photo he looks particularly unwell. So that last photo of me and him is one probably where I can look back at it, but it was quite a difficult time for me.
yeah.
And it's still a picture that I post because that's the most recent picture that I've got of me and my dad, and I do look at it fondly, but it's also a photo that does bring back quite a hard time. When I think about just growing up, similar to you, there was definitely a period of time, which I know this is sort of silly to have a regret over, because I think all teenagers go through this sort of phase. Um, but when my parents separated, there was a period of time where I really didn't like to go to my dad's house, because it was just far away from all of my friends and things like that. And had I knew what I know now, which obviously I didn't, there was no way I was ever going to know that my dad was going to pass away when I was still young. I would have gone every single weekend, and I
Every
would have
day.
every year, and I would have given up that time with my friends to go and sit in the park or do whatever I was doing. So I do sometimes look at that and like think about even some of maybe the conversations that I would have had with my mum when I was younger, like, I don't want to go this weekend, I don't want to, go to dad's house, or I don't want to do that, whatever it was. And I think, oh God, challenge, you should have just gone. But like, they're things that you
You
can't
just don't
change.
you just don't know. And
No.
the thing is, when you're a teenager, like you say, you're just so preoccupied with other things, like, and it's definitely not spending time with your parents,
No,
unfortunately.
and I think
So
all kids do that, right? I mean, my stepson actually loves to spend time with us. He's only just starting to get into that phase where he's
you're going
maybe
through
venturing out
phases
a
that you
bit more.
definitely go through phases though, don't you?
Yeah,
That's the
of course,
thing.
because like I went through a phase where I definitely didn't want to be at my dad's very often, because I suppose I was just getting a social life in terms of starting to go, being allowed out on my own with friends and things like that. And they were all getting together at a weekend, and I would have been in Bedford, so like miles away from all of them.
You feel like you're missing out. It's like a FOMO thing when you're a
Yeah,
teenager,
and
isn't
then
it?
as I got a bit older and you kind of get bored of that, that's where I spent a bit more time with my dad. I'm sure if my dad was here, he would probably reflect that there was times that maybe he could have spent with me that he chose not to as well. He had his own life and own I've spoke about the many women that he's dated. He was very preoccupied at times. So yeah, I think they're like, I don't want to say silly things because I don't think they are silly, but like we said, maybe you don't have as much control of, but at the time you did have control over it if you really wanted to. And had you have known what you know now, you maybe would go back in time and say, oh, I wish, when people, there's like a trend at the moment that says like you're speaking to your 13-year-old self or 15-year-old
Oh, it's really sad,
self.
that, yeah.
What would you tell them? And one of the things I would say would probably be spend some more time with your dad. That's like, you're not going to have that, especially as then I got older and the more that my dad kind of slivered into a different kind of maybe some old patterns, we spent less time together. We spoke all the time, but we didn't see each other very often. I think a lot of that was probably dictated by my dad maybe not wanting us to see him in that particular way. But yeah, that's probably one of my reflections where I think, if I could go back and tell a younger Shannon anything, what would it be? It would probably be that.
I get that, and ultimately that's been shaped by the loss of your dad as well, because I do still think there are people who are our age today that still have their parents
That would feel the same.
with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe that you just think, oh well, I'll see them in 2 weeks' time, or I'll see them in, even just a week's time. Whereas now, I think as soon as you lose that loved one and that parent, you just think, oh, I wish I'd have seen them multiple times a week.
Yeah.
But until you've gone through that loss, it's just not at the forefront of your mind in the same way, is it?
And let's be realistic. I'm sure there was things going on at that time that stopped you, but you don't remember those things. You only remember the fact that you didn't go to that barbecue that all your brothers and sisters went to, or you didn't, like those main kind of events in life.
Because like I said, you don't think that there's an expiration date on things. You don't think
No.
one day. It's like they say, there's always a last of everything. Like your last day of school, your last Christmas when it's all like nostalgic and you're a child
Yeah.
opening your presents, your last time that you stayed in your bunk bed and then you moved into your single bed, and like everything comes to an end. But that's not how you live your life when you're living through those moments. You just
No.
think about the here and now. But as you become older, everything does change. Your perspective changes, your circle becomes smaller, you focus more on the things that really matter, you're less bothered about what people think about you and in terms of
Yeah.
that judgment stuff. And I think the truth is a lot of that comes with growth as well as what we've been through and what loss does to you, because it is just such an inconceivable thing to go through. And even now, I'm sure you're the same, and I still speak to friends where they say, like, I just couldn't imagine how it feels to lose a parent. And the truth is, I really admire when people say that, because do you know what? It's true.
No, well, you don't.
Until you go through it, it's
You
impossible.
Can't. You can't. And what we've said is everybody's journey is so different. So even if I've lost my dad, how can I imagine what that would be like for somebody else? Because I don't know their relationship with their dad. I don't know the circumstances. So even as someone who's lost a parent, there's certain things that you can understand and grasp and,
Mm.
but there's other parts of it that nobody understands other than you. Your siblings might not even understand it, depending on what that looked like.
It's so
between
nuanced,
you.
isn't it? And like you say, like even just with siblings, you're going to have a different relationship typically. Not always, but quite often there will be differences between your relationship and your parents than your brother or your sisters.
I do think it
So,
depends what order you were born in as well, because like obviously you're the oldest, but I'm the youngest.
oh, my brother's golden boy though.
Yeah.
Middle child
Middle
is
child,
golden
yeah.
boy. Yeah.
But I think that plays a part as well in like the different relationships that you have with your
True.
parents and what that looks like and how involved you are. Like if you've supported in bringing up your brothers and sisters, even if you're only a few years older than them, like sometimes that means that you've got a different relationship with a parent than what it would do. Like for me, where I'm the youngest, so what that could be slightly different. But yeah, I think there was a lot of things that we spoke about last week in terms of when we speak about cutting people off, which there's certain reflections where you go, is there some regrets around that? For me personally, when I've had time to process and think about things, that's not a particular area that I have a ton of regret around, because I've had to come to the terms with the fact as to why I did it. But there was definitely times in my grief where I have felt some regret with that. So I do think that there is, it just depends where you are in that journey as well. Like something that one point feels like a regret doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to feel like that way long term. It's just when you're trying to comprehend what's happened, I think you regret almost
Everything.
thing.
It's the guilt phase of grief, isn't it?
Exactly that. There's a lot of guilt that comes into it that makes you feel like you regret things that actually, once you've had that time to process and be more understanding and kinder to yourself and have a bit of a wider spectrum of what happened, why it happened, that you can kind of say, do you know what, no, on reflection it's not so much a regret for me. But I do want to caveat that depending where you are in your grief, you might feel a ton of regrets at the moment that you may not feel in 5 months time, 6 months time, a year's time. It just really depends on how you're feeling and how you're handling the loss of your loved one. Doesn't even have to be a parent, but I know there's friends of mine that have had parents that have been sick that have regretted not questioning a doctor a bit more or pushing that a bit more. And you think realistically there is only so, you're not a doctor, you're not a
No,
nurse.
and you drive yourself insane with it.
Yeah.
Like we said before, you're always going to wish and want for more, no matter what the situation. I spoke to Mum a few hours before she passed, and in my head, I'm still like, I wish I'd have spoken to her more, but could I have spoken to her much more?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much involvement you had with that loved one. It's always going to feel really painful, and you're just going to go through that cycle of just wanting and wishing for more time with them. But like Shan says, I do think as sort of more time passes, you do realise that you couldn't have changed that, unfortunately.
No.
And the other side of it is, even if I've said it myself with Mum did end up having heart conditions. The amount of times that I used to really beat myself up about the fact that I wish I'd pushed my mum more to maybe go and get a diagnosis from the doctor, but I didn't know she had heart conditions. My mum didn't know. The doctors obviously didn't know because they weren't doing the test to
Yeah.
figure it out. It's
But
like,
also, I think sometimes when you look at those reflections, you forget that the character that your parent was as well. Like if you had pushed your mum, she probably still would have
oh,
done
she'd
what
have
she
been like, I'm
wanted.
fine. And do you know what? Like I said, she often used to get what she called MOTs, and they just, you can't pick up on something you're not looking for, right?
Yeah.
So you can't investigate everything all the time. It's impossible to. This is why, it's different if you're feeling really unwell and you are starting to get that investigating and getting the correct test to look for it. But if you aren't feeling well, sometimes it does take a long time to figure out where it's coming from. That is the truth. It's just the
Well,
part of,
unfortunately, a lot of the symptoms that your mum did have on reflection could have
they're
been
masked.
several
Yeah.
different things, like that a doctor would always rule to something less severe first because,
And that's what she did.
yeah.
That's what my mum did, because naturally she just masked it with, oh, well, this symptom's similar to, like, she thought she had acid reflux, which in theory she did have, but that wasn't the right.
Yeah. Why do you have acid reflux?
Yeah, there was more to it, but of course, if you've got an issue with your heart and somebody's giving you medication for acid reflux, you're not going to figure out you've got an issue with your heart.
No, exactly.
It's just one of those things, isn't it? And I think that is a part of your grief, particularly in the early stages, is that you just drive yourself insane with trying to figure out, like, could the condition have been picked up sooner? If they'd have been on medication, would it have resolved things? And even if somebody's sick, even if somebody gets something that's lifelong or, terminal, and eventually you're
Yeah.
going to lose them, like, I'm sure that's also something that you go through where you're just constantly bartering with yourself about, well, what if this happened, and what if I did this, and what if mum did that, and what if, but ultimately
You
it doesn't
don't
get you
know. Well,
anywhere.
I always think, could I, at times when I was going through my grief, there was definitely areas where I think I should have dragged him to rehab by
Yeah,
his
yeah.
shirt and like forced him into it. But that might have got him well for a week or so, but it probably, if he didn't want to do it, it would have never have resulted in having that support, and he probably would have hated me for it. And
It's at the
then
expense of you too, Shan.
yeah,
It's getting to that point of doing everything that you can within reason, of knowing what you know, because you don't know what you
no,
don't know, but ultimately you've also got to look after yourself and make sure that you're healthy and that your mental health is
And remember that they are human
protected.
beings as well. Just, I think it's really easy to, when you think about people that you've lost, to almost forget that they had their own
God,
decisions,
yeah.
their own things. So it's so easy for you to go, I should have spoke to that doctor, or I should have pushed more with the
No
mental
one's the
health
same,
team.
and everybody makes mistakes, and
Yeah.
everybody's under some sort of like level of pressure, and yeah, it's so tough. But I think that is a regret, isn't it? In the early days,
Yeah.
definitely. But I don't think I have it as much now.
I
Do you,
don't.
Shan?
No, I don't,
Yeah.
because I just have sort of, and maybe it's like a coping mechanism. I don't know, but where you sort of have to come to terms with the fact that you can't,
It's
you're
horrific,
never going to know
but you
whether
can't
that
change
would
the
have
outcome.
made an impact or not. You're never going to know whether that extra conversation with the doctor would have made them listen or not listen, or if I had pushed even harder and forced things upon my dad, whether that would have made any difference. And I think you could drive yourself mad going over everything. I think you concentrate on it at the beginning because you're looking um to understand why this has happened more, and because you can't rationalize it, your brain is looking for things. So automatically you kind of find fault in yourself and your actions and say, well, if I had did this one thing, that would have changed it all. And actually it's quite self-absorbed to think that you could think, you definitely go through
Mm.
that phase, we've all been there, but that you could have changed a whole turn of events. If Laura had pushed her mum to go and get things worked out with the doctors, that doesn't mean it would have stopped her mum having a heart attack,
No,
realistically.
and that
It might have made them aware, but she still could have had a heart attack and died. It might not have
yeah,
been that day, but it could have been another day. So,
absolutely. And like I say, it doesn't change the outcome. Unfortunately, you can beat yourself up forever and a day about it, but it's like I said to the doctor, um, my poor GP, bless him, when I went for my postnatal checkup, I basically just said I needed to wrap my head around how I'd lost my mum, because
yeah,
I just could not understand it, especially when in the hospital the doctors had completely ruled out a heart attack, and then ultimately they said it was the biggest type you can have. Um, and then when he spoke to me about it, he did give me some reassurance that because it was such a huge one, that she wouldn't have been in any pain and she wouldn't have known anything about it. And it was
well, I
almost
remember, did he
like,
say something to you like, unless she'd been laid on the heart, on the like already in surgery with a chest cut open and a heart like ready to go, there would have been no way of anyone stopping
even
it?
then,
Yeah,
because she had a STEMI, so she had one of the,
yeah,
yeah, she had the biggest one you can have. Ultimately, the way that he described it to me was, it was literally like turning a light switch off. That was it.
yeah.
And of course, there's all different types of heart attacks, aren't there? So like some people can have a heart attack and not even know about it.
Yeah.
So
But yeah, so you definitely go through phases of different regrets, and I don't think regrets are ever really lifelong. I think you sort of maybe come to terms of them at different phases, and some you'll hold on to longer than others. If we're talking post death law, is there anything? I know you mentioned one. Maybe you want to go on a bit more detail, just sort of the frenzy of searching things and
oh
looking at
god,
things that you
yeah.
wish that you maybe hadn't have done.
I do regret it, but at the same time, I also give myself a little bit of, I sort of let myself off a little bit and think, do
Yeah,
you know
'cause I
what?
don't think you had a choice.
No,
I
but
think that's
yeah,
what you needed at that time. Maybe now you can look back and say it wasn't helpful.
I did regret it though. It probably a few months in. So after I first initially lost mum, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I could not rationalize things, like Shan said. It took a really, really long time for us to get the post-mortem back from my mum, weeks. And I was just sat there thinking, I need to know. I need to
Yeah,
know. And as a human being, I think because you're going through so much pain and you're trying to grieve, but you can't, because you're going through trauma in terms of like the shock of the loss.
we're also very curious beings.
Well, I just don't have the answers.
Yeah,
I couldn't even, it wasn't even a case of I could think, oh, well, maybe this was the case, maybe that was the case. They just said, we genuinely have no idea what's happened. I was like, how can a healthy 55-year-old woman be here one day and not be the next, then of course Google is just your own worst enemy, because even if you type in that you've got the symptoms of a cold, you're
You're
dying, aren't you,
dying. Yeah.
basically?
You're already dead.
So it came back with all sorts, and I do regret that, because it put me into a really, really dangerous cycle of like coming up with all these conspiracies, and what if this could have happened, and what if this person should have been involved here, and what if somebody is like didn't want my mum to be here anymore, and that's why it happened, and and that's normal as well, like we said before. If you are going through this, you aren't crazy. It is a phase. But it's just ultimately because you're in so much pain. Your brain's trying to find the logical side of how it's happened, because you can't emotionally deal with the loss. So I do regret that, but I gave myself a little bit of a whole pass on that, because I just think, well, do you know what? It's the way that I got through it, and afterwards, I do say to people now, don't do that. It's easier said than done, but it didn't help me. It didn't make me feel any better. It set me a bit mental, to be honest, for a short time. And I think instead, I wish I had put more of my time and effort into, and look, this is easier said than done, isn't it? But just focusing on my mum and how beautiful a person she was, and not focusing on what took her from me.
Yeah. Which I think you can do in hindsight, but in that moment, it's just not
No,
possible.
you just, we always say, don't we, Shan? In those early days in particular, you are basically just fighting to survive. And that might sound like a bit intense to anyone who's not been through this sort of loss, but there are days when you just don't want to be here.
And there's no real rule book to it, is there? There's no one telling you. And maybe that's partly why we wanted to do this podcast. It's not that this is like a word for word what you shouldn't do, but if you're early in your grief, maybe learn from some of our mistakes, or learn from some of the things that have really helped us. Not to say that you will feel the same, because we're all very different people, but
and the afterlife stuff, avoid that as well, unless you are a spiritual person and you want to think of like the really positive stuff. There's some pretty scary stuff out there.
Yeah, it's not for me.
And it's just, do you know what? Again, that's something, Sean, don't you feel the same? This is a regret for me, actually. It's quite a prominent one. I'll be honest, I hadn't ever really thought about the afterlife. I don't really think as a human I thought that much about what happens to somebody when they pass away. Because I was really fortunate until I lost my mum that hadn't really lost anybody like super, super close to me. I unfortunately lost my auntie and my cousin, and that was really incredibly sad. But not somebody who was sort of direct family.
I think I'd thought about it a little bit more, because I lost my great nan, who was like a massive, massive part of my life. I was still a teenager. No, how old was I? No, I was 18. So yes, technically still a teenager. 18 or 19 I was when she passed away. And that was really, really hard for me at that time. And I think I had maybe thought about, at times I can feel her presence still.
Yeah.
So maybe I'd thought about it a little bit more than you, but I it's not something I've ever really gone, even since losing dad. It's never really something I've particularly spent a lot of time looking into. I think for me, it's like a personal feeling for me personally, rather than, people's assumptions of what might happen. I'm not religious either. You aren't either. So.
I think it's something that you don't necessarily even think about as a concept, unless, obviously, of course, you're interested in it. But then as soon as you do lose somebody who was very close to you, and they're here one minute and gone the next, you think, well, where are they? So they must have gone somewhere. They can't just not exist anymore. And I think you can drive yourself mad with that as well. Because
is that something that you thought about a lot?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
This is the thing. It's so good, because
where's she gone?
To hear about this sort of stuff, because I didn't have any of those thoughts. So that's interesting.
Oh, it was awful. And like I say, the internet is a bit of a dark place. So I regret looking at that, because in my head I was trying to think of all the happy, sort of positive things that could happen, and nobody really knows. I know there's loads of theories and ideas and stories, but obviously nobody that's on this earth, well, in theory, has passed away. And I mean, look, there is reincarnation theories, again, not my thing, but I did look into them, because I was thinking, well, maybe my mum is that black cat.
Yeah.
down the road that, you
No,
know.
I get
Because
I
it's just,
get
it
that.
just doesn't, I think it's just one of those things. All of a sudden, I was more inquisitive about it because I thought, are these people onto something? Maybe my mum is here somewhere because I just couldn't wrap my head around,
That she's
well,
completely
where is
gone.
she? Yeah.
That's a really interesting theory. I'm not sure I've ever thought about that in
You'll Google it
great
now
detail.
tonight.
No, but I think possibly because maybe because I had lost my great nan, or maybe it's like a family thing. When I was growing up, they always used to say, like, because I've lost a couple of people when I was still fairly young, so like my great granddad as well, when I was really little, and they always used to say to us when we were little, like, the brightest star in the sky, like, that's your
Oh,
granddad, or that's your, like, nan. So when I was younger, I always used to look for, like, the brightest star and then say, right, there he is, that's where he, like, do you know what I mean? And maybe
oh,
that's
so
maybe that's
nice.
stuck with me a little bit.
Yeah, that's maybe how you think about it versus
Yeah.
like a Quavers wrapper that some people say. Or my mum's would probably be an empty bottle of wine.
Yeah.
Oh no, a
My dad
full
to be
one.
next
A
to it,
full one.
yeah.
We'll let you be a full one. Obviously,
Yeah.
you're always a glass
Yeah,
full.
my dad's probably a bottle of vodka or something. So.
Exactly.
No,
Yeah.
but I think that's maybe my family have been like spoke about death quite a lot growing up. My nan unfortunately has lost quite a few people, so I think maybe that's something that I experienced a bit more as I was growing up. I'd lost my great nan, my great granddad, my granddad, so I've grieved before, I would say. Like, I've got definitely with my great nan, that was maybe the biggest loss that I'd had prior to losing my dad, and it definitely did shake me. You know, she was a massive, massive part of my life. I used to go and stay at her house for like the full 6 weeks holiday, like literally weeks and weeks on end. I was there when she took her last breath, so that was something that I had to kind of contend with and deal with, and it's not actually something I've spoke about massively on the podcast. I think we've kind of concentrated on our parents, but there has been elements where I've lost people before, so maybe that's something I've come to terms with in what I believe where people go, or
Makes a lot of sense, that,
yeah.
Shan. It does. And yeah, perhaps for me, like, my first loss was the biggest one I probably
Yeah.
could have had, and I think that does make a lot of sense in my head actually thinking about it now, because we never talked about loss really in my family, just because we were quite fortunate that you
Yeah.
hadn't lost grandparents before, and so all of a sudden I was like, whoa, like I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know who to speak to about it, because of course I would have spoken to my mum.
Do you know what's
So
possibly worth us speaking about, Law? Because I know we had a conversation about it at the time, and if you don't want to talk about it, feel free. Because I've not kind of preempted this before. But I had been to a chapel of rest before to see my great nan. I'll be honest, I regretted doing that
oh
in that
yeah, you said this.
scenario.
Mm.
Um, because I was there when my nan took her last breath. So I got to say my goodbyes and have that conversation with her and talk to her before she passed away. So when I went to go see her in the Chapel of Rest, actually, she didn't look very familiar to me, because I don't, not to be too morbid, but when they prep people after death and things like that, they don't always look the same. So that's one of my regrets when losing my grandma. I just wish I hadn't done that, because I found it quite uncomfortable actually. But when I lost my dad, because I hadn't spoke to my dad in, quite a few months, and I felt like there was like a lot left unsaid, going to the Chapel of Rest and having that conversation with him and spending time with him and seeing him actually he looked better. That sounds terrible, but
Poor
because
John.
I know, poor John, but because my dad obviously drank and things like that, you lose all of your bloating, so he looked really well. So for me, that brought me a lot of comfort seeing him in that way. But I do remember a conversation with yourself where you didn't quite feel the same. You sort of, maybe there was a little bit of regret around that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, that, Shan, because I think a lot of people go through this, don't
I
they?
agree. Yeah, it's very
It's
individual,
very
very
personal,
personal.
and you get a variety of responses, and ultimately you've got to make that decision yourself, I think, because I asked so many people, and like you say, Shan, plenty of people told me they got comfort from it, and plenty of people said they didn't, and unfortunately for me, I did make the decision to go and see my mum. The one benefit of a lot of funeral directors is a lot of the time they will give you a bit of a
Pre-warning.
pre-warning as to whether they recommend that you see your loved one or not. And again, you can of course decide to go against that, but I think that's a really lovely thing.
I agree.
Because from my perspective, and of course everyone's different, I I really regretted seeing my mum in the chapel of rest. In some ways, I'm glad I did go because I put in some special things with her.
Yeah.
So I put in like my little Bollinger cork
Yeah,
for her
it
to
did
go
look
with.
fantastic.
Not a full bottle of Bolly, but everyone was like, "Plum
That
it."
should have blown up.
Being cremated. But she, she would have loved to have gone out with a bang.
She
That's
would.
that's my mum.
Oh, that's
jeez.
hilarious.
So that's for you, Mum. She'll be laughing. She'll be
she'd love
laughing up
that.
there. But yeah, I found it really difficult. Do you know what it was? My mum was always cold. Like, she just she always felt like she was cold. So if you went to her house, I'm not joking, it felt like it was about 30 degrees. She always had the heating on full whack, the fire on in summer. Like she just loved to be really hot. To the point where it always used to make me laugh whenever my husband used to go around. He used to have to stand at the back door to get a bit of a draft and some air in. And of course, obviously, when somebody's passed away, even though they do prepare them really well, and they did a really lovely job with my mum, and she was in a beautiful, like one of her favourite dresses, but she was cold. And I know that sounds like a really obvious thing.
I had the same with my nan, but I'd prepared myself for that a little bit because of
it sounds
that.
daft,
But
though, doesn't it?
I really struggled with that with my great nan because she was obviously, if you touch a human, even if if me and Laura touched now, even if Laura was cold, I would still
feel human warmth.
Yeah.
Like life, basically. That's what it is, isn't it? You feel life, right? And unfortunately, obviously, like I say, because my mum always liked to be cozy because she always felt cold. She always was a warm person, and she wasn't. And I think I sat there and I chatted to her, and I just thought, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And I know my brother felt the same way, actually. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that. He found it really difficult despite putting our special things in with her. And I'm glad I did that. So there's one side of it that I don't regret.
Yeah.
But then my sister, actually, of the three of us, who I think a lot of people would probably not expect this, she got a lot of comfort out of seeing my mum. But like Shan said, she just didn't really look like mum because she was so full of life and she was just so like effervescent, and it had been some time as well that she's being investigated. So yeah, it is a personal thing. So I suppose if you're thinking about this right now, or if you feel regret for it, you're not on your own. But
no, definitely not. Like I say, and it goes to show where you've got myself who's done it twice, and one of the times I regret it and one of the times I don't.
You didn't, yeah.
So what I would say to you is, just because you've regretted it before, don't let that put you off maybe in a different scenario in the future.
Definitely,
going to do it, because I think it just depends on the situation. I think when I said goodbye to my nan, there was probably no real reason for me to go to the Chapel of Rest. It was just I didn't want. It's funny, I did it because I didn't want to have any regrets that I didn't. So it's almost like
very conflicting, isn't it?
It's super conflicting, because maybe I would have felt some regret had I not have gone, but then I did it and now I regret that I did it. So I don't think there is a right answer. But my sister didn't want to go and see my dad initially, and we gave her like, you don't have to, but just have a think about it, this, that, and the other. You can go and and not see, like, essentially they give you the options that you can go open or closed with the coffin, and they'll put a picture on top so that you can feel like you're speaking to them. And I said to her, like, you basically, maybe you go and do that, like, and see. So what my uncle offered was to go in with her first of all, so that she wasn't on her own, and then if she wanted to go
me and my brother did that,
then she could, and she did. And my uncle left her in the end, and she spent time in there. And I said,
it's quite scary.
Yeah, it is. It is scary
when you first go in. You're sort of like,
I think because I had done it before, she'd never done it before. I said, if you want to go first, I'm happy for you to go first, and I'll sit and wait, or we can like swap. And then we did go in together as well. But she said that she's so glad that she did it. Like, she got loads from it. So again, she initially had like a lot of reservations of going to, because let's be honest, like you're going to see, like, putting it bluntly, a dead body. It's not something that comes naturally to any human being, really, unless you work in that space. Essentially, it's not something that you're prepared for, even if you think you're prepared for it. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting topic to maybe bring up, because I know I've never ever heard anybody talk about it widely. I've had conversations with people, and then me and you had a conversation I did with you prior for you went to your mum because my dad's situation, and then you did the same to
Yeah,
me
with
but
you,
before I went
yeah.
to go and see my dad. So but let's sort of talk about, let's kind of get rid of some of those taboo subjects, because I do think that it's something that some people might feel really awkward in terms of saying that they regret it. But listen, I think that's completely normal if that's the case. Like, and if you didn't go
Yeah.
because you felt like you might regret it, there's plenty of people that would do the same. And I would consider next time, unfortunately, if somebody passes away, I might decide, do if I've had that moment with them and got to say goodbye, I probably wouldn't.
Because it's your lasting moment. I think that people put pressure on themselves to have that lasting or that
Yeah.
last moment. And for me, even though it was really the way that I lost one was so traumatic, but she'd not long passed when I saw her in the
Yeah,
hospital.
exactly. So you'd had that moment with
Yeah,
her.
and that's how and fortunately, let me tell you this as well, because hopefully this is reassuring. Even though I do regret seeing her in the chapel of rest, I'm glad I did go with my brother because we did it together
Yeah.
and then we had separate time. But I don't know if it's something that my brain does to try and sort of help me to get through it.
Yeah.
But my lasting memory is in the hospital.
Okay, so that's
So
interesting.
something has, I don't know whether it's intentional or like subconscious, but I do think back to that moment as being that's the last time I saw him. It wasn't,
To
but
be
yeah.
honest, I don't often reflect about my dad in the chapel of rest either.
No.
I think it was like it more of an emotional, like, for me, in terms of just being able to go and say some things to him. And listen, I don't know, I'm not saying he could have even hear me, that you could be talking to nothing. This is what we were saying before. But for me personally, it was more of a just a like, I want you to know I still love you, and I'm sorry that we weren't talking when this happened, all those kind of conversations that
It's a
maybe
bit of
you,
closure again,
yeah, a
isn't
bit
it?
of emotional closure on it. But I don't really, although I was glad that he looked so well, and that was the last time that I saw him, which is very odd to say, but he did. He looked really angelic. We all said that. He just looked so peaceful, which, considering the way that he died, I think that's
That's lovely.
lovely for me to have that, because I think, unfortunately, again, this is not spoke about very widely. Suicide can be quite a graphic, even if you didn't see it, mentally can be quite a graphic thing to think about in terms of imagining the way that somebody passed. And that, for me, after my dad's death, was something that I really struggled with, was just the mental images. So what that allowed me to do was put that aside and look at him and see how peaceful he was, and
Hmm.
almost again come to terms with the fact with that it was his decision, and he looks like he's at peace with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really comforting way to look at it, Shannon. I'm really glad that that's how you feel. And I think the only other regret that I'd maybe say is worth us kind of closing on. I know we spoke about this earlier as well, Shannon, is that again you're not going to know this until you're in the moment. But when you're in the very early stages of loss and your grief, it's very raw. You're in a very dark place. You don't know what you want. You don't know what's going to help. You don't know what's going to make you feel
Yeah.
worse. And if you're very fortunate to have people around you that are making their best efforts to be there for you, whether that's offering to come and see you, to make some food for you, to pick something up from the shops for you, I would just say that to anyone who is doing that, I appreciate from your point of view, and you're getting rejection and no's, it must be really difficult to hear that.
Yeah.
But do try and understand that somebody who is grieving isn't doing it intentional to hurt your feelings. Like, they still very much love and care for you and will definitely appreciate what you're doing. But you almost just don't know how to even survive in those early days or even how to leave the house. But what I would say is, I think I was quite quick to let people in, but I know other people who haven't, in terms of offering that support. But ultimately, you do need to try and let your loved ones in. If you've got somebody
Yeah.
who's continuing to show up for you and they're being persistent in their efforts to try and be there for you, hopefully they'll continue to do that. But there is only so much people will do, and that's the
Yeah.
truth as well. So I think that's also something to just bear in mind, that try and be at some point Doesn't have to be straight away,
Receptive.
but yeah, try and be receptive at some point, or just say, thank you so much, but I'm not quite ready for this right now. I'll let you know when I am, or give an alternative of what might help at that time.
Yeah, so maybe it's like a regret of, pushing people away, because really, I think I don't regret maybe the bit of pushback I had at the beginning, but I was probably very similar to you, that when I
We
was
accepted
ready,
it
I
quite quickly, but some people
accepted it
don't
back
do that. I
in.
know, and again, we're not. We understand how hard it is, and I appreciate sometimes you do feel like you just want to be very isolated and alone, but it is really important. I do know people that have had regrets that they perhaps weren't accepting for a very long time, and that friendship has kind of maybe
Yeah, well, that's it,
isn't the
because
same.
people are trying their best to support you, or most people are trying their best to support you the best way how. And if you're not giving them anything back in terms of an indication of what you need, because perhaps what they're offering isn't what you need, but they're not mind readers. If you don't tell them, they don't know. Um, so, one, I would say, in terms of from an outsider's perspective, I don't think you'll ever regret trying in terms of putting that effort in. And I know that from myself with you, but also from speaking to Paula, and she's got no regrets of carrying on the way that she did in terms of trying to consistently give us support, and reach out to me and be there for me, even at times when maybe I've said, no, I'm okay actually today, like I really need some space. That didn't mean that next week she didn't try again, and the week
Yeah.
after she didn't try again. But also, like you said, on the other side, Law, if you are going through grief, try and
Acknowledge it at some
acknowledge it,
point.
and sort of, even if it's just saying, I really appreciate, thank you so much, I hope you don't think I'm being ungrateful or anything like that, I'm just trying to deal with this in the best way I know how. And I don't know how. Like, essentially, so maybe if you're sat there at the moment and there's some friends that you've maybe pushed back on, in terms of offering support, maybe just give them a little message and say, like, thank you so much for everything that you offered. I know I didn't take you up on a lot of it, but that's not to say that it isn't appreciated. And
Yeah, just talk about it and sort of acknowledge it later on if it was difficult at the time and you couldn't accept it. It's just having that conversation to say, look, I did really appreciate it and I'm sorry that I wasn't sort of
and
open to the ideas of it.
realistically as well, like, even when you're going through grief, sometimes you can get things wrong, like, and I think we just have to take some accountability for some of our actions during that time as well, because you're not thinking properly. There's a lot of things, some people can be quite snappy. We've spoken about that before. Some people can get quite angry, so when people are reaching out, maybe they're not being as appreciative as maybe they should be, or someone would anticipate to be. I think let's give them a little bit of grace in that area. But also, you are still a person, you are still deserving of people being polite to you. So maybe just have that conversation with your friend as well, and say, listen, I really really want to be there for you, and I know maybe what I'm doing is not ticking the right boxes at the moment. Like, if there is anything that you really need, and it is difficult, because this maybe contradicts some of the things that me and Laura have said before about being specific with what you offer, um which I think is what I would lead with, in terms of saying, let me come round, do this, let me come round. But if that's not being accepted, then I think it's okay to ask and say, what is it that you need? And I know that might be different this week to what it is next, but essentially, even if it's, do you just want me to make sure I'm keep checking in? Is it okay with you that I keep checking in on you, because I do worry about you? And it's just that letting them know that your intentions are good. And I'm sure if anybody felt, if you said to them, I'm not sure that I want to be the best friend to you I can be, or partner or loved one, whoever it is that you're supporting, but I'm not sure that I'm doing right by you at the moment, like, let me know what you want, because I really want to be there. I think most people would go, shit, I've probably been a bit of a dick here, and maybe not been as receptive when they've tried. You're actually doing everything right. I can't do any of those things right now, but when I am ready, I will come and tell you.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
that's a really interesting point as well, because I think it's maybe a little bit of regret on both sides to reflect on, and what we could be doing more or less of, or whatever. Because I do think there's sometimes when you get people messaging you and be honest about it, Law, you kind of go, oh, I just don't have the energy to
Yeah, and
message
like we say,
back.
in that moment, it might be impossible for you to, and particularly in your really dark days. But ultimately, it is about at some point just having that conversation to
Yeah.
say, I really did appreciate that you were reaching out then, and I'm really sorry I wasn't as receptive as I could have been. But like I said, this is after countless
Yeah.
times of
Well, the thing is, you don't want to come to the end of like, I was about to say the end of your grief. There's not an end, unfortunately. I wish there was, but maybe out of that first dark period where you start to find your new normal and what your life's going to look like, and you start walking back into the kind of the real world, I suppose, outside of your grief bubble. You don't want to get there and realize that you've pushed all of your friends and family so far away that they feel really disconnected from you, and maybe slightly underappreciated, because I don't think people give to receive. But if you have tried like multiple times to support to someone, and they essentially are like, go away, at some point you are going to go,
you are,
I don't
yeah,
think my presence is
you're going to
wanted or
retreat at that
needed,
point.
and retreat, and you might find it really difficult to get that back. So we don't want any of you guys going through grief to regret that in the future, that once you're ready to do those things with your friends or your family, that then you find it difficult to get that support from them because you've pushed them so far away that now they're finding it difficult to offer, because they might feel like they're stepping on eggshells and they don't want to upset you, so they don't offer anything. So I think that's really important to talk about in terms of regrets. But I hope you guys have enjoyed that episode. I feel like we've covered a few different grounds, haven't we?
We have, yeah.
But again, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Spotify, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We're across them
All the socials.
all the socials, and we really appreciate everybody that likes all of our posts and interacts with them, and any new listeners. I know I've had a couple of people reach out to me recently who've only just started listening, so welcome. Nice for you to join us.
Sorry that you're joining us as well.
Yeah. Exactly. We are sorry. It's a really sort of double-edged sword if you're listening to these and they relate to you. We're glad that it relates, and we're talking about things that maybe people haven't spoke about, but it also comes with a bit of sadness that you're here. But unfortunately, we're all going to be in a place at some point where we're grieving, and at some point me and Laura might be sat here saying we're going through another grief, we've lost this person, that person, or whatever. Let's not hope it's anytime soon, but that's just life, unfortunately. So yeah, thank you for everybody that engages with us. We really appreciate it, and share this as well. Make sure that you're sharing the podcast to any friends that you think might appreciate it. What I would say to you is, we've got some friends that are going through things like divorce and stuff like that have said they found it really interesting to listen to, because they find that that really relatable, because grief isn't just about death, it's about all kinds of loss, and
Very much so, yeah.
we've had people talk to us about that. So if you've got anybody that's going through a hard time, although they might not have lost someone in terms of death, don't feel like that they wouldn't maybe relate to this, and give it a share to them as well. But we will see you all very soon.
Take care. See you soon.